Good evening. I'm George Capellas, a professor of architecture and chair of the Ryerson University Department of Architectural Science Lectures Committee, and I'm the host of this evening's lecture. Welcome. On behalf of our department chair, Mark Gorgolewski, I'd like to welcome you to Ryerson University. This evening's lecture is the final lecture in this year's Ryerson University Department of Architectural Science lecture series. For those joining us for the evening, I welcome you to Ryerson. During this period of the COVID pandemic, we are operating virtually, and this evening's lecture is one of the many activities we are holding to support student learning and outreach into the professional and lay communities. Our lecture is sponsored this evening by the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction. We are grateful for their support, and I'd like to extend a warm and special welcome to Paul Laurendeau, architect from Montreal, who's attending tonight virtually and representing the Canadian Institute of Steel Construction on their behalf. Thank you for being with us this evening, Paul. I've invited our dean, Tom Duver, who's a great supporter of our department, to say a few words about Ryerson, and welcome our guest, Deborah Berke, architect and dean of the Yale School of Architecture. So I'll turn it over to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, George. Established in 1948, Ryerson University's history is rooted in Canada's post-war drive to provide career-driven education to meet contemporary societal needs. Ryerson began as a post-secondary institute designed to combine technical education with academic theory, and has since grown to be a major comprehensive and research-intensive institution in the heart of Toronto. At the Faculty of Engineering and Architectural Science, we are making meaningful shifts in culture, the kind that lead to greater democratization of technology and improved quality of life for all. We do so through the 9 undergraduate and 25 graduate programs that we offer, and the scholarly, research, and creative activities that we engage in with our community and partners. The Department of Architectural Science plays an important role in these endeavors and is home to undergraduate and graduate programs in architecture and building science, with an eagerly anticipated master's program in project management to be initiated shortly. Ryerson sits on lands that are now known as Toronto, which are inhabited for millennia by many Indigenous nations and peoples. It is our tradition to begin our meetings with a land acknowledgement, which not only recognizes the enduring presence and resilience of Indigenous peoples in our area, but is also a reminder that we are all accountable to these relationships. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. It is in this spirit and on behalf of our university that I welcome you all to Ryerson and our department. And on behalf of the faculty, I welcome you, Deborah, to Ryerson. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much. Today's lecture will be given by the distinguished architect and dean of the Yale School of Architecture, Deborah Berke. Before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to briefly describe this evening's program. This lecture is being delivered live from Deborah's New York office through a Zoom webinar on Fifth Avenue, I think you are, right, Deborah? Our speaker has agreed to address any questions and comments from the audience at the end of her talk. Therefore, you, the audience, are invited to post questions and comments you may have through the webinar link. Our panelists, faculty member Carlo Parenti and fourth-year architectural science student Marwa Al-Sakar will receive and monitor questions. At the conclusion of Dean Berke's talk, I'll turn the podium over to Professor Parenti and Ms. Al-Sakar for questions and discussion. At the close of the discussions, Marwell Sakar will say a few words of appreciation to our speaker on behalf of the students and faculty, and then I'll conclude the session. Now to our lecturer and our guest speaker. I'd like to invite June Commissar, a colleague and a graduate of the Yale School of Architecture, to say a few words of introduction about this evening's speaker. Over to you, June.
Thank you. It is my great pleasure to introduce Deborah Berke, the Dean of Yale School of Architecture, the first woman to hold this position. Dean Berke has been teaching architecture since 1977 after completing a Bachelor of Fine Arts from Rhode Island School of Design, an honors thesis from the AA in London, and a Bachelor of Architecture from Rhode Island School of Design. She also holds a Master of Urban Planning from City College in New York and an honorary doctorate from Rhode Island School of Design. She is the founder of the New York firm Deborah Berke Partners, where, along with her 10 partners, she has designed many outstanding projects. Among the firm's most significant works are the residential colleges at Princeton University, the Cummins Indie Distribution Headquarters, the Rockefeller Arts Center at SUNY Fredonia, and the Yale School of Art in New Haven, Connecticut. For this body of work, she has been honored with, among many other awards, the National Design Award from the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, the Medal of Honor from the AIA New York, and is on the Architecture A-List from Elle Decor. In 2012, she was the inaugural recipient of the Berkeley Rupp Prize at the University of California at Berkeley, which is given to an architect who has advanced the position of women in the profession and whose work emphasizes a commitment to sustainability and the community. Her devoted service to the profession is also notable, as she is a board member of the James Howell Foundation, a member of the board of directors of Yaddo, an advisor to the Norman Foster Foundation, and she serves on the jury for the Pritzker Architecture Prize, the highest honor in the field. Let us give a warm welcome to Dean Deborah Berke.
Well, thank you, George, for hosting this event. Thank you, Tom, for your kind words of welcome. And thank you, June, for that lovely introduction, and greetings to everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm really sorry we're not physically together in Toronto. George and I had hoped that by spring of 21, things would be better in terms of the pandemic. They're improving, but we're not quite there yet. So I'm with you on Zoom to give you my lecture entitled Now. Let me see if I can make this work. These are crazy and difficult times, and now has never felt kind of more present and more truly now, at least not to me, because the past 12 months have been brutal. And as you all know, it has been very different. We don't go to lectures or movies or much of anything anymore. And you all know that there has been a lot going on, from the pandemic to Black Lives Matter and social activism, to immigration policies, to highly polarized politics, not only south of your southern border. I know we provide excellent entertainment for you all, but around the world. And there's a lot going on, and we have a lot on our minds. So although I'm calling this lecture Now, I am first going to go back to 1997 and start by taking you with me on a reevaluation and extension of my thought process since then. In 1997, Stephen Harris and I edited a small volume of essays called Architecture of the Everyday. It was published by Princeton Architectural Press and included articles by Mary McLeod, Joan Achman, Mabel Wilson, and Peggy Deemer, among others, photographs by Gregory Crutzen, and design projects by Sheila de Betteville and Marianne Ray. And at the very back of the volume, there is a short essay by me, more of a manifesto, in fact, and it was titled Thoughts on the Everyday. And now seems to me like a good time to go back and reconsider it as we think about what everyday life, normal life, extraordinary life should look like. I started that essay by saying We exist in a culture where heroes have been replaced by celebrities and 15 minutes of fame are valued over a lifetime of patient work. And I continue, in this climate, the architect must become a celebrity in order to gain the opportunity to build, or else must loudly proclaim a refusal to build in order to become established as a critical force. For under these rules, architecture can only emanate from the hand of a brand name architect. The built environment is strewn with these high-profile celebrity products, heroic gestures neither made by nor commissioned by heroes. Now, I said all this stuff in 1997, and if anything, the situation has only gotten more pronounced and significantly worse. In the essay, I went on to ask, what should architects do instead? And then I wrote a simple and direct response: acknowledge the needs of the many rather than the few, address diversity of class, race, culture, and gender, design without allegiance to a priori architectural styles and formulas, and with concern for program and construction. That directive remains true today, and of course, it can be said to have only become more pressing and more necessary, perhaps. The fact that architecture has made so little progress in this direction since 1997 is a disgrace, and perhaps contributes to aspects of the many difficult conditions we are experiencing today. So there's a little bit of a backstory to this, because the initial impetus to search for a definition of an architecture of the everyday evolved from an ongoing conversation I had with Stephen Harris as we traveled together to New Haven from New York City and back twice a week for 9 years. We were colleagues at Yale. We were friends and our conversations were familiar and comfortable. Our commute took us on Interstate 95 and the Merritt Parkway, and that turned out to be a pretty good place to have a twice a week conversation on the everyday, it being such an everyday condition itself. But over the course of the years of our shared commute, those nameless food and fuel stops you just saw became McDonald's and mobile stations, a transformation to a form of name brandedness, I'll call it, apparently sanctioned by some highway authority. And similarly, the exclusive suburban residential developments that were just off the highway grew ever more extravagant as the ready dollars of the 1980s purchased houses that were absurd amalgams of aspirational imagery and bombastic size. Our ongoing observations seemed to find that the banal landscape, which was the fuel for our conversations on the everyday that eventually led to the book, were each day becoming less anonymous, and certainly less banal. So in my essay, I went on to list 11 points I felt described this architecture that I was so passionately arguing for. Now, you might find some of the words I used to be negative, but I meant them all as positive qualities. And they included things like anonymity, domestic life, and program, among others. Now, today I am less convinced about the word everyday, or at least what the word meant to me when I used it in this essay. I think the word has lost much of its meaning. From Henri Lefebvre, maybe some of you have read, to Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, understanding, critiquing, and celebrating an architecture of the everyday made a lot of sense, I think, through the end of the 20th century. But we are entering the third decade of the 21st century now. We're deeper into late stage capitalism, the rising global superpower is China, and the world is on fire in the United States and elsewhere, both metaphorically and quite frankly, literally, as recent research indicates we will irreversibly cross the 1.5 degree temperature rise in 2025. So if I were writing that everyday essay now, there would be an explicit insistence to myself on addressing architecture's role in the global climate crisis. The noted environmentalist Bill McKibben says that most of the momentum destroying our Earth is hardwired into the systems that run it. So to change that obviously requires we think differently about how we design buildings. In addition to the environment being missing from the essay, so is enough of an explicit emphasis on the city, where more than 55% of the world's population now lives. The environment is an urban issue, of course, but another urban issue is access, which means to me the just distribution of resources and the freedom of the city that is fundamental to urban citizenship. Another is the defense of privacy from the techniques of surveillance and manipulation that prevent us from freely forming our sense of self. Michael Sorkin wrote those words in 2003, before much of the tracking technology we live with today was developed. And we are now going to have to wrestle with the need for privacy balanced with public health concerns going forward. And finally, about the city, valuable living, cultural, and physical urban ecologies must be preserved. The use of public space as a place of expression must be maintained in a way that is peaceful, safe, and just. In addition to the environment and urbanism not being mentioned in my essay in any substantive way, neither did I write with enough criticism about the profession itself. I don't know the data for Canada, to be honest, and it wasn't so easy to find on Google, but I imagine it is relatively the same as the United States. It's important to acknowledge that the diversity of the profession doesn't begin to reflect the diversity of Western societies, nor the talents of its many intricate and overlapping cultures. So another thing we must do is acknowledge that architects alone don't determine the built environment. We're part of a large team that includes structural, mechanical, and civil engineers, among others, like acousticians, lighting designers, sustainability consultants, wayfinding consultants, preservationists, landscape architects, botanists, and environmentalists, and urban planners, regional planners, and transportation engineers, professions with similar issues of underrepresentation of women and minorities. And all of that, all of those professions and people and all that work, that's before the building is even built, because then there is the very complex choreography of construction, which includes skilled teams of people who can form and pour concrete, frame with timber or steel, plumb, wire, waterproof, tile, and paint. Who gets to do this? How do we train them? How much do we pay them? How much do they respect what we do or we them? And how are we going to change that? And of course, who decides what can and can't be done? How tall can it be and what use type can be where you can build, what you can build, and who do we build for? And that brings me to justice. Built environment social justice is what I've been calling it. Beyond the profession, the larger societal issue, particularly in the United States, but also throughout the world, is one of social justice. When I was in graduate school studying urban planning, we were taught zoning was good. It was what prevented the tannery being built next to the nursery school. We were also taught that a little bit about the bias and exclusionary zoning in the United States, but nowhere near in depth enough where we taught about the deep intrinsic racial discrimination written into zoning codes, mortgage legislations, and deed restrictions, among others. For Americans, as you know, much of this comes from our appalling history of slavery and the racism that has followed it. For Canadians, I know it's different, but I believe there are issues for you that relate to the treatment of Indigenous people, which is a problem we share. And I think it's interesting to note on this map, for instance, to see how tribal lands have nothing in common with today's nation-state boundaries. There's also the fascinating question about land rights in Canada. I don't know if you know this book, I love this book, as they relate to your underground empire of mineral extraction and the fact that half of the world's public mining companies, not exactly saints, are traded on the TSX. So, as a practitioner, what should we be doing? Because it's one thing to state all that I just said as a teacher and an educator, but vastly another to figure out how to roll it into practice. Here's what we all share. Students, faculty, my partners, the architects in my office, and I think the architects in every other office and studio, we share this architect's brain. I think you'll find this funny, certainly the big words ambition and the tiny little words like creativity. And maybe it's funny, particularly after all that serious stuff, but as amusing as it is, there is no mention whatsoever of the responsibility that we have and of all of the things we need to do. I mean, we all love the mess that creativity can produce, as well as appreciate the order and clarity of rigorous organizations and systems. But as I said, there's more, because the responsibilities of the built environment are to all people, and our responsibilities for the greater good is more pressing than it has ever been. So as architects, it must be the built environment writ large that we take on. I'm going to propose we call what is necessary now an architecture of the greater good. It includes the issues I've mentioned, like engagement, plurality, inclusion. And in that context, and with no arrogance, because we are definitely not perfect at this, no one is, I thought I'd show you some of the work of my firm to talk about how we're trying to do that right now. Sometimes it can be simple. You as an architect can feel fulfilled about projects that look good, but more importantly, also do good. So encouraging a client who is building a house to set up sustainability goals and note that they are an essential aspect of good design. This house is LEED Platinum. Or to use only locally sourced materials, which is not only a sustainability approach, but also, I believe, ties the building to its site. Design new buildings with a richness of surface detail to help revitalize a small downtown and actually encourage people to walk. Come up with great design ideas for old buildings that the community fought for decades to save and you have helped put to new use. Or do the same for an old underutilized former factory that not only puts the building to a new and unexpected use, but brings life to a part of the city that has for years had streets empty of people and empty of activity. It's great to work for mission-driven organizations that support communities, as we did here in the facilities for GMHC, an organization founded as the gay men's health crisis during the AIDS epidemic, and still providing services for the AIDS and HIV positive community. Or here for the Wallace Foundation, who works to improve learning and enrichment for disadvantaged children and vitality in the arts for all, where the idea was to make spaces where people who work on grants to all different sorts of organizations could meet collectively to exchange ideas. Build libraries in small towns where they function not just as a place to borrow books, but also as town centers where older citizens might go to read during the day and where children go after school to do homework and where community organizations can hold meetings in the evening. Or design neighborhood bookstores, even if they're in the Hamptons, as they too become gathering places, as well as being a necessary part of reinforcing the strength of local businesses and mom and pop stores and active retail street frontage. And as an architect to do pro bono work. In this case, we did a project for an organization called Chop Chop Kitchen that teaches children and families about real food, healthy eating, and meal preparation. All that feels right and good right now. So I'm going to show you a few projects in a bit more detail and talk about the ways in which we try as architects to contribute, to be part of an undertaking that's making an architecture of the greater good. And I'm going to start that conversation with the conversion of an old New York City public school. Here's what it looked like when it was in use as a school and when the elevated train still ran on First Avenue. The building was later abandoned by the Board of Education and reoccupied by arts groups, sort of guerrilla style. They broke into the building in the early 1970s. Now, that elaborate cornice that you see here had been removed long ago. And today the building houses 4 arts organizations: Mabu Minds, which is an avant-garde theater company; Performance Space New York, one of the city's oldest off-Broadway theaters; Painting Space 122, which is an artist residency program and gallery space; Movement Research, a dance movement studio program; and one health organization, Alliance for Positive Change, which is an outreach group to aid the HIV positive community in the neighborhood. The idea on the exterior was that the addition would have some presence, but not too much mass. The addition itself is clad in perforated stainless steel, meant to shimmer in the daylight with varying levels of transparency and not look anything at all like the 125-year-old brick that it abuts. The addition is partially placed in the tiny indentation that the original building had, which you can locate in this drawing by looking where the black poche and the elevator is. That's where the indentation used to be. The addition allows for an at-grade entrance, so accessible to all, an elevator, proper bathrooms, and a 21st century fire stair, unlike the 2 existing stairs from the 19th century that existed in the original building. Here's the new lobby, the first one the building ever had. And as we worked on this project, we tried to relocate found parts of the building wherever we could, like this old stained glass window, which we put above a new door. And in the same space, we decided to show rather than conceal the new steel structure necessary to reinforce the old building. We kept all of it simple so that it could be about the artists and their work and not about the architecture. Some of the former classrooms are painting studios for the artist residency program I mentioned. And what was interesting was that all of the arts organizations said, whatever you do, don't make it too nice. And they were saying, don't erase the history. It's what makes this building special. And they were referring both to their history and to the buildings. We listened, and you can see on 2 sides of this photograph some of the old columns that are now in the small theater of Mabu Minds. So we cleaned and repainted the old and always contrasted the new, because I feel very strongly that one doesn't imitate the past and make fake old. So as you can see in this extension of the stair railing, as it goes up to a new top floor. We raised the roof to create a high ceiling space for performance. It might sound counterintuitive to put the biggest, most public space at the top, but it was the most economic approach to a column-free space, and it had the added benefit of bringing visitors through the other activities happening on the lower floors of the building and also give access to the roof terrace. Here's that new large theater. It's very raw space, perfect for the kind of experimental theater groups that the Performance Space New York organization invites. You see a set here for a piece called Farsa by Renata Lucas. And you see here a set for a group called Bruges, which is an urban skateboarding coalition, and they're choreographing, excuse my English, a piece here. The idea behind the addition was to allow light out at night to indicate activity inside to the neighborhood and to the city beyond. And you see that here as well as get a glimpse of our replacement cornice, which is a bench and a guardrail for the roof terrace, as well as being a part of an art installation of the building, which you see here. I think it's going in this video slowly, I hope. Maybe not. Sorry, you don't need to see it. Anyway, the cornice lights up in indication of the building's occupancy. Similarly, years ago, we created a new facility for the Yale School of Art. In this case, we radically transformed a much newer, a mid-20th century building that had been designed by Louis Kahn. He's much better known in New Haven for the Yale University Art Gallery and the Yale Center for British Art than for what was New Haven's Jewish Community Center, which opened in 1954. But he designed it. His stamp is on the drawings. It was sold to developers in the 1980s, and they did nothing with it. And Yale purchased it in the late 1990s when it was a water-soaked ruin with all the flashing piping, wiring, and paneling stolen in the intervening decades. And we were hired to turn it into an art school. We decided to organize each department and the black box theater of the drama school around a central signature space, each one, that would give identity and allow for crits, gatherings, and shared events. Each of these departments, painting, photography, graphic design, has a distinct identity separate from the school as a whole. Graphic design was placed in what had been the old gymnasium, where we added a mezzanine for the student work area, added skylights to bring more daylight in, and exposed the original trusses which had been hidden in the gym ceiling. The photography crit space is in the former swimming pool with the new floor at about the 4-foot deep mark. And if you look at the top right of this slide, you can see that kind of unmistakable green pool tile at the top of the wall beyond the pinup wall that we added. And we reconceived what had been an auditorium into a flat-floored omnidirectional experimental theater for the drama school, shown here in a contemporary staging of As You Like It in 2019. You can see those spaces in this section, including a drawing studio in what had been multiple kindergarten classrooms on the lower right, and the theater and gym on the main floor, half a level above the street. And on the upper right, there are the shared undergraduate painting studios, which are at the north windows of the Kahn building, which had once upon a time been a series of small administrative offices. The graduate painting students each get their own studios in a new building that we designed for them on an immediately adjacent property. We also gave that space, that building, I should say, and that department, a 2-story crit space that serves as its central organizing and gathering room, as with the other departments. And one overlooks it. You can see the fuzzy person in the orange sweater here upon entering the building, possibly seeing one's classmates in a crit and being able to join the conversation. There's also a shared space between the two buildings. It's sort of the art school's courtyard. I must admit also where the art students smoke. And I will say, as someone who went to RISD, that it is always a treat to design an art school, a place where creativity is supported and nurtured, and where gathering and exchanging ideas are key parts of the program and of the mission. So more than a decade later, we got to dramatically rethink and expand another art school, this one in upstate New York, designed by I.M. Pei in the 1960s. He, along with his partners, Harry Cobb and James Freed, used modernist planning and a distinctive design language to create a remarkably pure idea for a campus for the State University of New York. The campus authorities didn't stick to the rigor of the original plan, as you can see in the photo on the right. In the center, in the red box, is the Rockefeller Arts Center, abutting a large parking lot rather than trees. And we were hired to do a 60,000 square foot addition and fix all the problems of the original building, which I can assure you was not designed for the climate outside of Buffalo, New York. This is the character of the campus, concrete and single pane glass. And this is the site plan of the Rockefeller Arts Center today. The back of the building is now the front, done through our addition in red. So we gave the building a new entrance, giving it a front at the point of arrival. And we thought a lot about how the building would relate to the existing. As you can see in this study model, one of many, many, many that we did. And we did a lot of program studies. What we wanted to do was to respect Pei's palette as well as express the creativity of the activities within rather than hide them, which is what his building had done. And in fact, in the front right of this image where the concrete wall is perforated are the work yards off of the sculpture studios. We thought a lot about light raking across surfaces and how to calibrate not only the texture of the concrete, but also the relationship of metal and glass. And we inverted Pei's palette, more glass, more surface texture, less concrete. And we gave the facade depth to decrease the solar gain and provide the building texture and rhythm in contrast to the smoothness of the 1960s vertical surfaces, which in this photo are on the right. As I mentioned, I went to art school and I love the directness of these art making spaces. This is the sculpture studio. This is the new daylit ceramic studio. And these are meant to be working spaces. They're tough and they foreground the work, not the building. And as at 122cc and at Yale, we tried to save what mattered. And here we saved the door frame. These are two photographs. And if you look at the left-hand side of the right photograph, next to the black line, you see a door frame where generations of acting students and visiting faculty signed their names. So you keep stuff like that. We also made what had been Pei's long, relentless exterior wall, which is on the left side of the left photograph, more of a dynamic interior, and really used and populated by the students. We added a big new dance studio. That's a space for instruction and also a space for public performance. And the idea here too was that its materials are basic and inexpensive, but the light and proportion make it a stunning space to work in. And with open and lit spaces like that, the building has become a marker of all of the performance, study, and art on the campus. Now, sometimes the project has a mission that is more emphatic, as it was for the women's building. We won a design competition to renovate what had originally been a YMCA designed by Shreve, Lamb and Harmon, no less. They're the architects of the Empire State Building. And the Y was for sailors coming into New York Harbor. But unfortunately, as shipping changed, Seamen's House closed and the building became a New York State prison for women. It also became a forbidding and foreboding place. Smaller wired windows were set into the larger openings and prison doors with slots for the passage of food were added. It was horrible. And then when the west side of Manhattan flooded during Hurricane Sandy, the prison was evacuated and the building was left to rot even further. The state eventually allowed developers and organizations to put forward ideas for what could be done with this property. And an organization called the Novo Foundation proposed a women's center, a place to house a variety of NGOs, foundations, and other organizations devoted to addressing the issues of women and girls globally. So the state selected them, and they in turn held a design competition, which, as I said, we won. And once the project started, we participated in all sorts of events to draw the public into a conversation of what a building like this should do. What should it be? So there were street festivals and all kinds of events, including ones led by women who had been incarcerated in the building. We met with them to hear directly about their experiences, as well as understand what parts of the building needed to be saved to tell its history, and what parts should be destroyed or replaced so no one would ever have to experience what they did, what bad experiences they had had. So we did programming sessions with groups and organizations, and we did lots and lots and lots of listening. It felt right to put a mission-driven organization with a program like this one into a neighborhood of galleries and luxury housing. The luxury housing is immediately adjacent. It's the tall gray and white check building on the right here. Our design added to the existing building to have enough square footage for the mission of the organizations. And it completely reconsidered how the internal spaces would be used, which were spaces for gatherings, meetings, teaching, broadcasting, job training, daycare, medical care, and hosting conferences and events. The most important idea was that it be accessible and transparent in its activities, essentially the opposite of what it had been when it had been a prison. And while there is enormous optimism in rethinking and reusing these kinds of buildings, and it's something I very strongly believe in, it's what cities need today. I regret to say that in this period right now of little optimism and great difficulty, certainly in New York and elsewhere, of course, this project has been put on indefinite hold. But we certainly learned a lot from the process. Now, sometimes we do wholly new buildings, but in them we continue to care about mission, experience, and community. This is a building we recently completed in Indianapolis, the headquarters for a division of the Cummins Corporation, which is an engineering and engine manufacturing company in Indiana. They bought an entire city block on Market Street in downtown Indianapolis, 3 blocks from the War Memorial, which is at the circle in this drawing. You just kind of can't miss it. And you can see the building from the center, 3 blocks away, but you get a much clearer sense of what it's like when you turn the corner and see it from the south, where it opens to the space we created for a park, which was designed by David Rubin of Land Collective. The light and air-filled lobby, in fact, has an entrance both on Market Street, the primary street, as well as one from the park. And in the center of this image, you can see the stairs that go up to the 2nd floor. The top of those stairs is at the center left of this plan, which is where the access from the parking garage meets those who are coming up from the lobby. And the idea was that everyone arrives at the same space, which is where there's coffee and dining and a training center with meeting rooms and classrooms that fill the rest of this floor. You can see that connection in this section where the staircase is, and it sets the spatial idea for the rest of the building, which are 3 double height areas that connect people visually and socially. The Cummins folks call them hubs, and they're also connected by a mural. Each of the 3 hubs has a different staircase to create identity within the building. Here's a closer look at the stadium seating one, which connects floors 7 and 8. This one we called the pretzel stair during the design process. It connects floors 5 and 6. And each of the floors is designed so that the most collective and communal work is closest to the center and the quieter, more focused work is at the ends. And the straight run stair with an open kitchen beneath connects floors 3 and 4. And you can see that these spaces are daylit from the south. And here you also see the lowest segment of that mural, as well as, I'll talk about the outside for a minute, sorry. Engineers work in this building, and they really liked this sort of scientific calibration process of designing the facade. The idea was that the narrow floor plate would allow the building to be completely daylit, which was both an environmental and quality of life decision for the people that work there, but that in turn then required passive shading elements, horizontal shades and vertical fins that vary in their depth depending on their location, as well as opaque panels that help create places for solid walls, privacy, add to insulation. The sustainability consultant on this project was Atelier 10, and with them together, we had significant reduction in energy consumption from a typical office building, but also by sort of condensing and making the building vertical, we were able to create a park. So the park handles the site's stormwater, covers its own irrigation needs, and to get back to something not sustainable, the mural that I mentioned earlier is actually also visible from the park as well, which you can see in the sort of center of the building in this slide. So the mural is a shared experience at different scales and levels of immediacy. What was interesting is that when we started this project a number of years ago, this end of Market Street was virtually empty. But there's been a lot of new downtown residential development happening, people moving to downtown since this building opened. And while we considered the experience of the employees, it mattered to us and to Cummins as well that the project provides something for the city, for downtown office workers and for the new residents alike. So as I mentioned, by organizing the program vertically, we were able to create a space for a park. And in it, David Rubin, it was great to work with him. And the park is now, only a few years later, very, very lush. Heavily used during lunchtime, and certainly very heavily used during COVID when people could work outside in good weather. And also used for civic events. And you can see David's work here, a little bit of a riff on the pattern of some of our fenestration used in his paving patterns. And what's been nice is that it's become a destination on weekends as well as during the workday for people from all over Indianapolis. As was mentioned in the introduction, we're currently building 2 new residential colleges at Princeton, where they have decided to expand the size of the undergraduate student bodies. Princeton has a fairly small undergraduate college, and so they're adding 1,000 students, which is big and is part of an effort of diversity and inclusion. The new residential colleges are comprised of 8 connected buildings stretching across a relatively steeply sloping 11 acres at the southern end of Princeton's historic campus. It's well under construction. Students are going to be moving in a year and a half or so. And it was our goal in this project to carefully choreograph a series of exterior and interior routes that would continue the pattern of open courts of Princeton's campus, but with a more modern and more transparent and welcoming presence, which was exactly in keeping with the spirit of making Princeton feel open to more students. We're using brick and wood and metal on the exteriors and wood and a lot of color on the interiors with a lot of visibility between levels and spaces. There are 2 dining halls, one for each college, that open each into their own courtyard, one more wooded and one more orchard-like. And they also share a lower courtyard between them, which you can see in the middle of this site section that's visible to people walking down the hill through this part of the campus. And part of the design idea, and not true about the rest of Princeton's campus, was to create outdoor spaces where student-driven, non-programmed things can happen, like performance or poetry readings or music. And the beginning of this expansion of the campus to the south is meant to integrate further expansion that Princeton anticipates in the future. Now, this word is pronounced Next Haven. It's an artist residency program in New Haven, started by the well-known artist Titus Kaphar. I met Titus many years ago now at the 21C Museum Hotel in Louisville. The owners there collected his work, and perhaps you're familiar with it. We discovered how our lives overlapped through clients and collectors and institutions and certain strong beliefs. This is some of his more recent work. On the left is a print, part of a show that was at MoMA PS1, where portraits of imprisoned men and the charges against them were turned into poetry by Reginald Dwayne Betts and Titus doing the drawings. And on the right, you see some of one of his large paintings, which are always commentaries on racism in American history. Titus has been featured in the New York Times when he won a MacArthur Genius Award. And that article from the Times also refers to the project that I'm about to show you. And it's one that connects Titus's work to what he believes about life. Art literally changed his life, and he is working to use it to change the lives of others. So Next Haven is located in the Dixwell neighborhood of New Haven. It provides studio space, gallery and community space, live work space for artists, a small jazz performance space, and training and mentorship programs for students from the James Hillhouse High School, which is about a block away. And I should say Yale is about half a mile away, and the world of Dixwell and the world of Yale have almost nothing in common, unfortunately. Next Haven occupies 2 abandoned factory buildings, one where medical equipment was made and one where ice cream was made years and years ago. The buildings more recently and sadly had been used to manufacture counterfeit goods, and even more sadly for prostitution. Now, I hope this video is going to work because I want you to hear Titus talk about adaptive reuse. Let me see if
I like this idea of adaptive
reuse. You're going to help me come up with a better word for it.
Well, we'll work on it, but I never thought about it in this way, but it's exactly parallels what I do in my work.
There you go.
So there, in my work, generally, there are these historical images that I take and I remake. And the purpose is very similar, right? There's something that piece did in its time for the people who saw it, who experienced it, that was important for that time. But in the present, somehow we recognize that there's some kind of absence. There's something missing from the neighborhood.
So we thought we would retain the entire complex of buildings, but various conditions made that more costly and complicated than it was worth. So we kept the 2 primary original buildings and built 2 new ones. They're the ones in the pale colors. On the ground floor, there are 12 artist studios, and on the left, there's a large room for events and shared activities, and the entry is in the center with a gallery beyond it. There's a jazz space in the basement, along with workshops and other facilities for the artists. Next Haven now has its 2nd group of artists in residence, even though there's still construction going on, and more people applied to their residency program this year than to the Yale School of Art. Titus's idea was that the facility would be open and welcoming, and really that's exactly how we envisioned it. I go there every couple of weeks to see the artists. I love the work they're doing. This is the old factory space that has become the Great Hall and installation space. You see it here prior to an installation with the high school interns who are paid for the work they do here. The artists really make their studio spaces theirs for the year that they're there in residence. And there's a variety of types of studios to allow the artists to pick that which is most appropriate for their work. So you can probably tell from things like Next Haven and the Women's Building that we like to work for organizations whose missions appeal to us. Often these projects fall outside the scope of standard commissioned architect-client relationships. I think that's good. And in our office, whether it's hosting exhibits for artists whose work we find meaningful, or running kids' workshops, this one's at the Cooper Hewitt, but we do them in local schools as well. We really try to be engaged and engage with the world beyond design. And we try to acknowledge that there are other issues that architecture can't address, like finding a cure, say, for breast cancer. So here we are on a fundraising march. Because I would really like for architects and architecture to be less intimidating, so people feel they can engage in conversation about and share in the shaping of the built environment. So toward that end, I have actually appeared on podcasts and on Ina Garten's Barefoot Contessa TV show. That was fun, really good food. Some of the podcasts are meant to be funny. That would not be me, I'm serious, but Michael Ian Black's a pretty funny guy. And if I were to bring this to a close and back to where I started, if I were writing that essay now, I'd use some different words. My list of adjectives to describe this architecture of the greater good would be these. I think it should be unique without arrogance, original without pretension, honorable, ethical, truthful, wise, compassionate. Still a little ornery. Ornery is okay. It's okay to make a neon green building. I think you can argue for new meaning and expression in design. But you always have to be considerate of others and open-minded, which means being open to new ways of imagining the future, because there are many ways to build. And I think we have to ask of ourselves as architects that we never forget our responsibilities, because in 2021, we are offered a chance of something genuinely new to come out of the current burning shambles of today's disorders. These are not new challenges necessarily, although they might be in high relief right now, and they're definitely difficult ones to overcome. But we as architects and designers, we're the primary contributing authors of the built environment, and we have to be part of addressing them. We're here together, we have to work together to design and build better buildings, spaces, cities, systems, and regions. And I think that includes talking about beauty. Beauty is something I believe that everyone is entitled to have access to. We can disagree on what it is, but we should all be striving for it. We should design to engage a diverse community and create beauty and offer joy, not only through great buildings, but through great spaces. They can be pluralistic, they can be messy, but I think we have to be open to new ways of thinking and seeing and creating, of being a voice and having a voice that promises to be generous to all, that's committed to the future of a livable planet. I mean, look, we're not the ones who are going to find the cure for COVID. We are not going to be writing more just legislation, although I do wish architects would maybe run for office a little more often. But with our talent and our vision and our passion and our willingness to work with others across disciplines, I think with that commitment to create an architecture of the greater good, we can make the planet a better place and contribute to a more just built world. As messy and perpetually unfinished as that might be, it can always be on its way to beauty, joy, and good. So thank you very much. Happy to answer some questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deborah. That was most inspiring. I'd like to now turn this over to Carlo Parenti and Marwal Sakar, who will be taking questions. I don't know if any questions have been put into the chat yet, but I'll turn it over to you, Carlo and Marwa.
Yeah. So there we do have one question in the chat, but again, please add your questions to the chat or to the Q&A component of the Zoom. Thank you, Deborah. I just want to say that it's a real treat to hear you lecture tonight. You're very influential in terms of the work that I do, and The Architecture of the Everyday is a book that I often reference. And I like, based on this lecture tonight, I almost want to say that you can expand it to be the architecture of the everyday and now. And now,
okay, yeah. It's time for me to write another lecture. I just hate writing, so another essay.
Yeah. I think you're an architect's architect. You're also an educator's architect and an architect's educator. You're all of these things, and I guess given this prompt of an architecture for the greater good, which I think your work has always done, I would argue, and I'd say that the words that you mentioned at the end, the unique, the humble, were part of your work to begin with. I think it's always been there. But in looking at the kind of challenges that we face now with the disruption that's occurred, there's an opportunity to really address these issues that have been there for a long time. And I guess as an architect and as an educator, is there a need to change the relationship between the academy itself and the profession?
I think to that, the answer, that question has been asked forever, right? And I think the answer to it is always yes. But I don't, as a practitioner, and I often hear practitioners say this, yes, could you please make sure that they are right up to date on Revit? You know, that's what would change the dialogue. And what I think the profession should want from the academy is, yes, a set of professional skills, but more importantly, the ability that students come out with, the ability to listen, collaborate, and learn throughout their time at work, not just like education is done and work begins.
No, that makes a lot of sense. There's a question about when you began your study of architecture, did you anticipate where you would be today?
Oh God, no. No. I grew up, I don't know how well anybody in the audience knows New York, but I grew up in Queens, one of the outer boroughs, a nice neighborhood, but certainly not a wealthy neighborhood. There were single family houses that were small, quite close together, and they all were different. And when I was a teenager, I had a good friend. He was going to go to Cooper Union and study architecture. And we would walk around at night in the summertime and look at the houses and try to figure out how they were laid out on the inside based on what they looked like on the outside. And I vividly remember I was 14 years old and I went home and I told my parents, this is so much fun, I'm going to be an architect. But we didn't know any architects, you know? So I went to RISD, had a good time, studied architecture, and really never knew what was going to come next, just maintained curiosity and energy.
Okay, that's great. I'm gonna ask one more question just because I saw that Stefan popped up here with the question.
Oh, hi, Stefan.
He said that he knows from personal experience about the office culture and the group of like-minded individuals working together to create a beautiful work. When you work in the office, it seems obvious that the values of the studio are what the kind of issues you think of. Sorry, I screwed that up. What the values of the studio are and what kind of issues you think about. I'd be curious to learn about how you build and maintain that office culture.
Well, Stefan, nice to hear from you. And for those in the audience, a long time ago when he was a young architect, Stefan LeBlanc, wonderful architect now in Toronto, worked in my office. And now that we've gotten bigger, might be is part of your question, I think. How do we do that? And I think it's constancy, like no matter how big the team is or how small the team is, or how big the project is or how small the project is, you include everybody in the conversation. You're infallibly polite and generous. You act your beliefs. You're always decent, kind, and patient, right? Because the world is a tough enough place without conducting work like an asshole. I don't know how else to say it.
I do want to piggyback on the topic of education. First of all, congratulations on your reappointment.
Thank you.
And on the conversations that I've taken in from your lecture about learning and unlearning your past perspectives and opinions and applying them today, I was wondering what kind of conversations have you taken in from your students within the school, or if any conversations or perspectives have emerged or have been inspirational for you from them. Does that make sense?
So I'll be really candid with you. The past year of being an educator has been really hard. And I think it's been hard on faculty, it's been hard on staff, it's been hard on administrative leadership, and it's probably been hardest of all on students who are working in isolation, without the community. And when, talking about the quality of an office, it's also the quality of life in a studio space where you learn from each other. And, I think the life in studio, not that you shouldn't go home and sleep and bathe and eat, but life in studio matters a lot. But so when I said I was going to be candid, that's candid, but the more candid, and if you were watching what happened in the United States last summer with Black Lives Matter and the unrest that followed, I have tried in my first 5 years of being a dean at Yale to enormously increase the diversity of the student body. And we have succeeded pretty well. And part of that was by raising a lot more money to go to financial aid. But what we hadn't fully done, and not that we didn't have good intentions, but we hadn't altered or expanded enough of how we did things. We just assumed everybody would show up and fit into how we had always done stuff, as opposed to saying, wow, we have a broader, more diverse, more international, more complex group of people. We can't teach everything the way we've always taught it. We should actually listen to the new members of our community. So that's what I have learned. I think it's a lesson one keeps on learning, because it's a conversation that has to happen in perpetuity, right? Because there's always going to be somebody new coming that you can learn from and listen to, and hope that they also learn from you and listen to you. But that ongoing exchange. And in the built environment education, so in architecture school, I think it also goes beyond, you don't just teach, I'm not sure how you do it in Canada, but you don't just teach about New York and Los Angeles. You look at other cities, both in the country and around the world, or you don't just look at architectural history from sort of Western classicism only. You look around the world. It's like that, but it's ongoing. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, of course. I think there's a question, and I think it might talk about the legislation and planning that you wish more people in the architecture industry would cover. Louise Harpman asks, hello, Deborah, if you could make just 3 changes to either NAP requirements for the accreditation of architecture schools or to licensure requirements, what would they be? Or in other words, how should we fix ourselves in this institution?
Can you read the beginning of that question again? I'm not sure I heard you correctly.
Oh, sorry. If you could make just 3 changes to either NAB requirements for the accreditation of the architecture schools or to the licensing process itself, what would they be? Or in other words, how should we fix ourselves during the design process of the profession?
Oh boy, many more than 3, an endless list. I think accreditation probably began with the best of intentions, but it doesn't take a holistic view. It has turned life into a checklist as opposed to a vision. So I would really rethink what the criteria for accreditation is. And similarly, I would rethink the criteria for licensure away from a multi-choice test. My husband's a doctor. I don't mean to conflate the professions. They're very, very different, but he has to take an exam every 10 years, and you can take a written exam or you can take an oral exam. And I wonder what it would be like for architects to actually have to engage with other people instead of sit in a booth and click boxes on a computer screen, because what the most important thing about what we do is work with other people. And I think that should be part of what one needs to do to be a licensed architect. Sorry for the rambling, not very articulate response. Passionate on the subject. I'm also tired and hungry, to be honest.
Louise asks, do you think your thoughtfulness is present in other firms?
Oh, I have no idea. I assume so. I hope so. I don't know, and would never, ever, it's hard to be an architect. One of the things I really like doing is being on design juries that are sponsored by either local AIAs or schools or institutions or museums or whatever, because I think the best thing we can do is support each other as a profession. I mean, we compete for clients, yes, of course, but we also need to support each other.
I remember in one of your, I think it was one of your other lectures, or it might have been written somewhere, you said art is part of life. And there's a question here that's asking, I'm wondering about your background in the arts. How much of your practical and conceptual expressions are driven from your previous studies in arts?
I think it's not just having gone to art school. I like making stuff. I like having dirty hands. I like having art supplies and glue and tape and I don't know, even sequins and, you know, pipe cleaners, whatever it might be around. But my mom was a fashion designer and taught at FIT for many, many years. And she was always making something. So I think for me, it wasn't just going to art school. It goes all the way back to my childhood where there was creative activity going on in the house. And so I think, and I would say it's not just art as in fine art, although I have enormous respect for people like Titus and my many artist friends, but for anyone who makes, who sees something in their mind's eye and then creates it, I find inspiration. I get pleasure out of it myself, but I find inspiration in seeing that those proclivities in other people.
There is one question that I'm also curious about. Ken McSporn, I hope I pronounced this right. Thanks for the great talk. Part of the architecture of the city relates to context that used to be bigger part of the design of individual buildings, but seems to be increasingly diminished in an expanding list of new priorities. The architecture of the city is perhaps suffering as a result. Do you think that most architects are letting the overall design of the city take a backseat to the architecture of the individual buildings?
Kind of yes and no. I think you know, when you design an individual building, you are being paid by an individual client who is also spending their money on building a building, and buildings are expensive to build. So your focus has to be on what you've been hired to do. And I think the beauty of many cities is actually their composite collage-like nature of a building you design next to a building I design next to a building somebody else designs. That's all good. I think where it gets to be less good is when, like that picture I showed of Shanghai or London, where every building is trying to be a monument. That's not so good. So I think a little more being willing to be a building in your own right, but be a team player in the fabric of the city is what we need.
I also saw a fellow student from the Department of Architectural Science, Tommy Gomez, ask a question that's interesting. Hi, Deborah. Thank you for the awesome presentation. My question is, if you could go back in time, what is one piece of advice you would give yourself just as you were graduating from architecture school? Thank you.
Be forever curious about everything, because I think to be a good architect, you have to be truly culturally literate. So read, listen to music, go to museums, walk down streets, eat in weird restaurants, you know, everything you can possibly do to expose yourself to how other people think and make. I think I did that. I just wish I had done it more.
I'm going to read a question from Jennifer, and maybe you've already kind of answered this in some of your previous responses, but she's saying that you've discussed the importance of diversity of class, race, culture, and gender, as well as the values such as consideration and humility. Are these things that you implement in how you run your design office? And if yes, how so? So.
Well, I would say we try. We recently did a survey through the office to find out how people were feeling, and you know, we're not perfect for sure. So I think it's good to question yourself, but it goes back to a question that was asked a little earlier, both about what I learned at school this year about being more inclusive, and then how you yourself have to change to be able to be more inclusive. So it's a constant. It's like going to the gym, you know, you just got to keep doing it, or unloading the dishwasher. You just got to keep doing it.
We have an anonymous attendee that's maybe just to tag on to the kind of social equity with kind of environmental equity. Considering global conditions such as an increase in population, global warming, etc., how would you foresee the future of architecture? So just a small question for you.
Yeah, let me see. Future of architecture. I wish architects were more involved with the creation of all of the built environment, because I think if you look at it, you know, of the gajillion things that get built, something like 2%, I can't remember where I got that number from, but I think it's a real number. It's close enough, doesn't matter. It could be 5%, it would still be a terrible number, are conceived by architects or created by architects. And I think the thoughtfulness that we bring when we're at our best to big picture issues, it would be great if we were involved in more of what got built.
I see that some of the questions are very involved around advocacy and diversity. So
And you combine them all together?
I would say we combine them all together. Some of them, one person or an attendee, Jana, mentioned how you've attempted to adjust your practice and your vision and your values and adjust them to the culture of architecture school, and how it aligns with the perspectives you shared about what constitutes good architecture. We've also have a conversation from Doubledom Architecture and Design that speaks, if you think there are other ways that architects could be advocates for our professions and for a bit better built environment, which is a response to how you've addressed it and how you've approached it. And I believe Andre's is a follow-up, if you'd like, which they asked. Although most of the projects that you've provided were educational, in an educational typology, they're curious to know how you think these points apply to other typologies of buildings, such as housing, for example.
Well, boy, those are kind of a gajillion questions all wrapped in to one. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to answer it so well. Maybe I could start with the last one. I think maybe all typologies should be treated the same, which is with questioning that is generous in its understanding, but questioning nevertheless, because maybe the way we've always built or always thought about a program isn't right for right now. We don't do much housing in the United States, unfortunately, so I haven't had an opportunity to do that. I wish we did. But I think we also have to be more active in our communities as architects. I sort of jokingly said near the end of the lecture, well, when I said we're not going to cure COVID, that wasn't joking. That's true. We're not doctors and scientists and research scientists and public health people. But I do think if you sit on community planning boards or run for office in your village or town or state or whatever, or province or whatever it might be, if you are engaged in your community, that's a chance to give a voice for design, or even to say to people, Instead of spending X on the school, let's spend X plus 10 and make it a better school that will last longer or have more daylight or have more play space or whatever it might be. Like, be an advocate for good design that benefits all. You need to actually go out and engage your community to do that.
Jana Levitt is bringing it back to the academy again. So
Hey, Jana.
she's asking, first off, she says your work continues to be an inspiration. How have you, if you have, attempted to adjust the culture of architecture school so it aligns with the perspective you shared about what constitutes good architecture?
You know, I'll tell you, I'm going to show a picture. We at Yale do something called the Yale Building Project. We've done it for 53 years now, where the students design and then build a building. And I mention that because when I became dean, we started working for an organization called Columbus House, named not for Christopher Columbus, but for Columbus Street in New Haven. And they are an organization that provides housing to the homeless community. And what I learned from these people was when you give somebody a place to live, they're no longer homeless. So what's interesting about this house that I'm showing you is designed by students, built by students, and now lived in by two formerly homeless, a single Army veteran and a single mother with a child live in this two-family building, and they share the covered space in the middle. In 2017, you see the date here, the Wall Street Journal did a story on the, you know, as things always do at the end of the year, the best albums, the best plays, the best movies, the best architecture. And they had 4 buildings in the entire world that they that year considered the best architecture of the year. And this house, this 1,100 square foot two-family house, was one of the best buildings of 2017, one of only 4. And in a way, what that said to the students was you can do good and you could do good design that is appreciated as good design at the same time. So I think it's through teaching like that. Hey guys, I got to just tell you, I am really running out of steam.
Yeah,
I was going to say, Deborah,
I'm exhausted.
I was going to say, thank you very much, Deborah. I don't know, Carlo or Marwa, is there one other question that is burning to be asked?
That's probably a good place to end, I'd say.
All right. Deborah.
Hey, George.
First of all, I was very taken by your comment about things not being a checklist, but a vision. And I'm teaching in a second-year studio where our students are really struggling. We're doing housing with zoning, we're doing housing with the building code, we're layering all kinds of things onto it, and all of a sudden, we're not able to look to the left and look to the right and see what someone on another board in the studio is doing. So it's a real challenge. And the checklist versus the vision is a real conundrum, I think, for them and for all of them. The other part, I think, is the question that you raised about, or the comment that you made about curiosity. And you know, when I was in New Haven, I didn't go very far from where I lived to where I had to go to school, and I wasn't really very curious about New Haven. I suppose I should have been, but it's probably a function of our profession and our discipline that we are forced on one hand to zone in on things, and on other hands we're supposed to be globally acute and globally aware. So that's a conundrum that we all face, the issue of the checklist versus the vision, and the necessity to both be detail oriented and to think globally. So you put those on the table, and I'm not going to ask you how to answer them. I'm just going to say
Don't have an answer.
Thank you very much for doing that. I'm just going to say a few words of personal thanks to you. We're really sorry that you couldn't be with us in person this evening. The border between Canada and the USA remains closed, and Toronto and much of Ontario is in lockdown still. And that's tough on all of us, for sure. We had planned for Deborah to be with us in studio. You'd agreed to come and spend some time and chat with students and hang out with us, and that's not happening this year. Maybe we can make it happen next year. So I had the good fortune of being one of Deborah's students 3 decades ago in graduate school at Yale. And I will say, Deborah, you were patient and supportive as a studio instructor, which I think is really critical. And I learned from that. You were also very incisive and helpful in your commentary. And one of the questions that came up is, how do you level criticism that is not taken negatively, but is supportive? And I'm not going to ask you to answer that question, but I thought that was a really important question, because our students often look for, they want insights, but they also want to be, they look for applause and to be supportive. So I just wanted to say that it was wonderful to have you here. I thought you were very incisive, that I said in your commentaries and the way that work was presented to you. But on top of all this, Deborah, you're a joyful, fun-living, and optimistic person and an all-around wonderful teacher. And I was thrilled when our lecture committee agreed that we should have you come and speak to our students. And I'm grateful for your personal mentorship and friendship and for the time you took to speak with us this evening. So thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. And I'm going to say chapeau to you. Hats off to you for your wonderful talk. So I'm going to do a round of applause. We'll all do this for you, Deborah. And this concludes this evening's lecture. And I want to say thank you to everybody for attending. And special thanks to the Department of Architectural Science staff, including Alexandra Berceanu, our 2 technicians, Michael and Leo, the members of our committee for organizing and presenting today's lecture. And this is the last in our 2020-2021 lecture series. And I'm just saying that I'm stepping down as chair of the lecture series committee, and pleased to know that 2 of my colleagues, Terry Peters and Will Galloway, have agreed to take on the responsibilities. And we're looking forward to what they will, with the committee and our students, have to offer to our lecture series next year. So stay tuned for details, and hopefully we'll all be together here at Ryerson in real time and real space next year. So thank you so much, and good night.